So as people continue to join us in the virtual space, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone out there. I'm Julia, a bookseller with Politics and Prose. We're live with Claudia Kalb and Anne McDaniel discussing Spark, how genius ignites from child prodigies to late bloomers. You can follow the link in the chat to purchase the book directly from us at Politics and Prose. If you have a question for our speakers, please use the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's questions in the last portion of the discussion, though we apologize in advance if we run short on time. Additionally, we're glad to offer closed captioning for this event via Zoom's audio captioning service. To enable those captions, you can click the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And before we jump in, we do want to thank all of you out there for joining us this evening. We're really thankful to our family of loyal customers keeping our business and our spirits afloat. It's my pleasure to introduce this incredible book. Yo-Yo Ma's ear for music emerged not long after he learned to walk. And by the age of 7, he was performing for President Kennedy. By 15, he debuted at Carnegie Hall. Maya Angelou, by contrast, didn't write her iconic memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, until she was 40. What propels some individuals to reach extraordinary creative heights in the earliest years of life, while others discover their passions decades later? Are prodigies imbued with innate talent? How often are midlife inspirations triggered by propitious events, like Julia Child's first French meal at the age of 36? Do late bloomers reveal their talents because their skills require life experience and contemplation? Through engaging storytelling and intriguing historical and cutting-edge scientific research, best-selling author and acclaimed journalist Claudia Kalb explores these questions to uncover what makes a prodigy and what drives a late bloomer. In this series of linked biographies, Kalb follows the journeys of 13 remarkable individuals, from Shirley Temple to Alexander Fleming to Eleanor Roosevelt to Bill Gates, to discover the secrets behind their talents. Each possess a unique arc of inspiration. Each, through science, art, music, theater, and politics, reach extraordinary success at different stages of life. And each offers us a chance to explore the genesis and experience of genius. And moderating this evening is Anne McDaniel, who became CEO of Foreign Policy in May 2017 after a 30-plus year tenure as a journalist and businesswoman at Graham Holdings Company. She is also on the board of directors of the Match Group, the internet dating company that owns Match.com, Tinder, Hinge, Plenty of Fish, OkCupid, and many other sites. McDaniel chairs the board's compensation committee. On behalf of Politics and Prose, please join me in welcoming Claudia Kalb and Anne McDaniel. Thank you both.
Thank you, Julia. And hi, Claudia. So great to see you.
Great.
Congratulations. This is the official launch of your new book, Spark. Very exciting. I hope the last day or so, as people have been able to get their hands on the book, have been exciting and good.
Yes, excellent. Thank you.
Tell us about how this book came to be. You've always been somebody who wrote for both. You and I worked together at Newsweek for many years. You wrote a lot about health and science, and particularly about what drives human beings and exploring the human mind. What led you to this idea of sparking genius?
Right. So at Newsweek, I really did have the opportunity to just kind of delve into so much research on the brain and the mind. I've always been fascinated by psychology, really even going back to childhood. What makes people who they are? How do people find what they're meant to be? Why do some people find their passion so early and others zigzag through life? And I've just always been really fascinated by that. And I wanted to, in the book, delve into those ideas at greater depth. And I had done this short biography approach with my first book, Andy Warhol Was a Hoarder. I really liked using historical figures, famous people, as a lens to understanding human behavior. And I thought, I'll try it again. And this time I'm going to look at these moments of inspiration, moments of discovery, because I'm personally fascinated. And I think it's a topic that a lot of people find interesting because it's a very human idea. When do we discover who we're meant to be?
You know, when I first read the title, the word genius stuck out to me because I found it almost isolating or off-putting, because I expected it to really be about people that were very different, certainly different than I am. And I found something very, very interesting and different in the book. Tell me a little bit about how you define genius for the purposes of this exploration.
It is a very challenging concept. I mean, the word itself is almost impossible to define. I see it as the pinnacle of potential. It's sort of harnessing intelligence, creativity, grit, motivation, and then some element of good luck and fortune to just pursue and push past boundaries and borders, to really overturn a field, and then ultimately to leave some kind of very long legacy for generations to come in the way that you make changes. Picasso, Leonardo, all of these people we still talk about today. And I will say on the word genius that in the book, there is the pedestal genius, the sort of all caps, bright light genius, Leonardo and Einstein, and the ones we think of as those intellectual giants. But in the book, I really take the word and stretch it. I use it not only to define the highest achievers in that way, but also the genius that exists, I think, in many different ways. The genius in an idea, the genius in a new way of thinking, the genius in pursuing a whole new way of living a life. Shirley Temple figuring out later in life that she didn't just have to be a child star, she could become a diplomat. So genius in the book is stretched, and I think it humanizes the term.
And I think it's just so exciting to read because it's engaging. You can see people doing the things and finding the ideas that you're writing about from people that tend to be more famous. So let's break it down. Let's start with you sort of have three categories of people in your book: child prodigies, midlifers, and late bloomers. Let's talk about child prodigies. Julia referenced Yo-Yo Ma, certainly someone all of us have heard of, and many of us have enjoyed his music. But he was, I think, by age 7 at the Kennedy Center performing. He was literally a genius at music from the very beginning. But what made his childhood unique? What made him able to develop into really the wide-ranging human being that he is today?
It's one of the most fascinating aspects of his life that I explored, and it's one of the aspects he enjoys talking about the most, and that is the effect of his immigrant experience. So Yo-Yo Ma was born to Chinese parents who had moved to Paris. We're living in Paris when he was born. That's where he discovers music. That's where he points to a huge bass instrument and says, I want to play that at age 4. That's where he learns the skills he needs to become a musician from his father, who is a musician and a professional. But Yo-Yo Ma talks about coming then to the United States at the age of 6, close to 7, coming here and feeling suddenly that it's an amalgamation of things that are hitting him. He's got Chinese parents and a culture in the house. He's got the drama of being in the American landscape with the skyscrapers in New York City and the energy of America. And, the idea that he was speaking French one minute and eating croissants, and now he's in the United States. And he talks about how important the immigrant outlook is in the way his life developed, that it's very much an openness to experience. And this is true not of just Yo-Yo Ma, but of immigrants in general. If you look at Nobel Prize winners, a third of them are immigrants or foreign born. There's a sense of new adventure, opening one's eyes to new possibilities. And in a way, you have to remake yourself to something new. And I think that that's something that he's proud of. And I think he feels it really enriched his life.
And yet he has a very successful early life, and sort of at midlife, he begins to question, has he given enough? What would have happened if he were a social worker? What would have happened if he had done other things? Which is both so relatable and so unbelievable because of his extraordinary talent. What prompted that? Where did that come from?
Right. I mean, he gets to a point where he says, I didn't choose music. It became me at a young age. It wasn't my decision because he's a prodigy. It happened so young. And he really is at a point where he's going off to college. He decides not to go to Juilliard full time, but to go to Harvard, where he meets all sorts of people and learns about all sorts of new ideas, and realizes that music isn't the only thing in his life, that really his love of people is one of the biggest loves of his life. And he wants to use his music as a way to engage with communities. And that's what he's doing now. And so I think that's just extraordinary that he's a prodigy who questions his role in music and works out a way. He's now in his 60s to use music as his gift, but to do more than just music.
It also interested me that when he was a child at that first Kennedy Center concert, I think it was Pablo Casals who heard him play and who said, pretty good, or something like that. Don't forget to have time to play baseball. Don't forget to go play baseball. And I found that true in all of the children that you wrote about, that there was some need to expand their lives. And as parents and supporters, that it was important to think about how to make them citizens of the world instead of narrowly pitched as a genius at this or a genius at that. I mean, certainly there were some that rode their entire life on that and very successfully and contributed a lot to society. But you could see the effects of childhood and the other things they learned as people grow.
Right. And for that, I would point to Shirley Temple. I mean, think about her as starting to act and dance at the age of 3 and becoming the childhood sweetheart during the Great Depression. All of that joy she brought to the country through those movies. At a certain point, she wanted to just go to school, go to high school, meet people her own age, get out of the sort of box that she was in. And she was allowed to do that. She did do that. And she went on to her second phase of life she talks about, which is motherhood, raising a family, being a wife, and how important that was to her. And then I think because she did have that entree into the world beyond the stage, she was able to then reinvent herself in midlife to become a diplomat, to use those skills, I would say, as a child that she had to interact with people in this very fluid way, and to be able to do that on the world stage in a different way. And so it is remarkable that many prodigies sort of burn out. They don't become grown-up geniuses. And that's usually because of this isolation, inability to live within the social, realm that we all live in. And so it's wonderful to see it in these stories of Yo-Yo Ma and Shirley Temple, who really excel as adults.
And then you mentioned Shirley Temple as a midlifer, because she's not only a child prodigy, but as you say, she remakes her life. There were other people like Maya Angelou who had such terrible, terrible childhood. Yes. And didn't find her gift. And ironically, tell us a little bit about how silent she was as a child. And then her gift turned out to be her voice, both her ability to express and the beautiful sound of her voice.
Yeah, I really, I was writing that chapter, and at some point, probably 3/4 of the way through it, the word voice just came into my head. It's her voice. That's her genius. And what's amazing about her voice, as you mentioned, when she was very young, her parents dropped her at her grandmother's house to be raised. It was a poor neighborhood. This is the Jim Crow South. She's dealing with the indignities of racism, and she's raped at about the age of 8. That happens, and she essentially stops speaking. She talks about going mute for a very long time. It's a little unclear how many weeks or months, but she does not utter a word. And it's a woman in the neighborhood who brings her over and serves her tea and cookies and encourages her to learn poetry. And through poetry, she discovers a love of words. And as her life evolves, she has a child at a young age, and she needs to make a living. She starts experimenting with her voice. She becomes a singer. She sings calypso and she dances. She tours with Porgy and Bess. Then she becomes a writer. She uses her voice through words in journalism. She lives in Africa and works at a couple of newspapers. And then finally, when she is middle-aged, you say 40 years old, she is just a lucky moment having dinner one night with James Baldwin and Jules Pfeiffer, whose wife is in the literary world. She tells her story, and Judy says, this is a story that needs to be told, and calls this editor, Robert Loomis, who encourages Maya Angelou to write her first memoir. And so she does at 40. So her voice just evolves in that way. And then for the next 4 decades, she's writing and writing and writing so much that she lies on a bed. She rents out a hotel room and lies on a bed to write with her elbows in the mattress, and she gets calluses from how hard and how much she's writing.
And never uses a desk. She says the bed's her place.
Yes.
She's good at working from home days. She would work well in this pandemic. So some of the people you wrote about were alive. Some of the people you wrote about are no longer with us. How did you report? How did you research this? How did it looked to me like it was a lot of fun. I felt like you got to go a lot of cool places.
I did. I really, thankfully, the reporting happened before the pandemic, and I was able to go to sort of these places I call these moments, the places of ingenuity. So Isaac Newton's home in rural England, where, thinking about him in relation to us right now, he fled the plague in the 1600s, went to his family home at Woolsthorpe Manor, and this is where he had the time finally. It's a beautiful spot. Went with my family, we went into the house, went into the bedroom where Isaac Newton did optics experiments, and then looked out his window and you can see the same view of the apple garden. So it's just an extraordinary kind of being in the space of Isaac Newton. It's hard to even imagine it, and there you are. I went to Malaga, Spain, and where Picasso began his life. You can still see the building where he was born, the courtyard outside where he used to scribble and do little drawings in the dust, and this very vibrant sea town where he grew up. And then, I managed to get to Alexander Fleming's lab in London. It's just the same space as it was when he walked in there in 1928 and looked at that petri dish that he had left out on his messy desk. After summer vacation, came in, looked at it and thought, this is weird. There's some mold, something going on in this dish. So seeing that was incredible. The space itself hasn't changed, and being able to kind of relive that moment. Grandma Moses's house still stands in New York, and I ventured over there, drove through that countryside, and saw kind of the vistas that she depicted in her works, and interviewed her great grandson, Will Moses, who's a folk artist himself. So these reporting moments were just phenomenal, and really a window into these lives in the most present way you can possibly live them. And picking them, I think you asked about, was not easy. I had a long list of many people, but I wanted a medley of people who had different livelihoods, different professions, who lived in different eras, from Newton in the 1600s to Yo-Yo Ma and Bill Gates and Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, all of whom live now. And then, just a mix of men and women, and sort of this arc of genius, this moment of discovery, going from essentially toddlerhood to 20s to middle age to late. So that was all kind of it all went through a sifter. And these 12 came out with Leonardo sort of as an outlier, special conclusion, because I think Leonardo is the one who I call sort of the eternal genius, the one whose qualities of genius, which are just the incessant quest for knowledge, the ability to observe, the question asking, constantly seeking answers. It kind of reflects in the other people in the book, but I almost feel as if he never really had one moment of discovery or a certain spark. It was just kind of lifelong.
And another late bloomer you do a wonderful chapter on is Eleanor Roosevelt. And though Eleanor was certainly well known to us, well known in history, not to us specifically, even in her much younger years, she's Franklin's wife. She's not thrilled about the idea of becoming First Lady. Her life is totally disrupted when she discovers that he seems to be having an affair with the social secretary, someone she considered a very good friend of hers. And yet divorce isn't an option. She doesn't think, his mother won't allow it. And also his political career made appearances very, very important. So she goes on to find herself in this completely interesting and unique way. Tell us about her, and tell us about visiting her house.
Yeah, she is just remarkable. So she starts out with, her childhood was, I did not appreciate the difficulty of her childhood. she was an orphan by the age of 10, but during those years, her mother, she was not close to her mother. Her mother made her feel, as she says in her autobiography, she wasn't beautiful enough. Her father, she really adored, but he was an alcoholic and he was not around a lot of the time. And she really struggled. She was a shy young woman. She was insecure. And her moment, really, one of them anyway, was when she went to school in London, and the teacher there who ran the school, Madame Silvestre, really took an interest, saw this potential in Eleanor, and took her on trips, included her in conversations, gave her a sense of how much more there was in the world. And she comes back, she gets into doing some of her public goods work. She meets FDR, marries young, and they start having children. She discovers the letters from Lucy Mercer. It's also a kind of a tie-in to the pandemic idea. It's 1918, and FDR comes back from Europe, and he's sick. He has this flu from the 1918. So she's unpacking his luggage, and she discovers these letters. And that's the moment, she realizes what is going on. And it becomes, I talked to her grandson, David, who we talked about that being such a transformative moment where she realizes she has to live an independent life. No, they're not going to get divorced, but she's not just going to be holding him up. And she does a lot of that. She supports him. She's his eyes and ears after he's diagnosed with polio, but she begins to forge her own interests and her own path. And, by the time he dies and she's out of the White House, and now she's in her early 60s, and she spearheads the UN Declaration of Human Rights, one of her, I would say, proudest moments. She just continues to advocate for human rights. Her views evolve over time. She's not stuck in one way. She's incredibly honest. She writes a column where she answers letters and from everybody, anybody.
They're like questions. It's like, ask Eleanor.
Ask Eleanor everything from why were you wearing your corsage on the right versus the left, or, crazy.
She says, I don't know what the rules are.
Yeah.
And who cares?
She's refreshingly honest in that column. So yeah, I see her almost as she really does bloom. I think the word is really appropriate for her as her life goes on in midlife and later.
And how do Shirley Temple and Eleanor Roosevelt come to encounter each other?
So Shirley Temple is a child star, and Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR meet her. Eleanor goes out to Hollywood and meets her, and then Shirley's invited to Valkill, and we talk about Eleanor's home, Valkill in Hyde Park, New York, which is about as simple as you can get. It's a cottage. You can visit there and walk the grounds. You can walk Eleanor's path, which was the loop she took through the woods where she did a lot of her thinking. And she did a lot of barbecuing at Valkill. She was very simple. And one day, Shirley Temple, who was 10, comes for a barbecue with her family and takes her little slingshot and aims right at Eleanor with a pebble that hits Eleanor in the backside, to which, as Shirley recounts the story, Eleanor just kind of has the spatula in the air over the barbecue and doesn't flinch. So they Shirley gets a little talking to from her mother, but it's a wonderful encounter where there are these crossovers in the book that I discovered just along the way of reporting, and that's one of the best ones.
Yeah, and imagining Eleanor Roosevelt in this very basic place, entertaining heads of state, entertaining people of great wealth and some of tremendous intellect, and others of people of all kinds, and serving them hot dogs and hamburgers off the barbecue. It's so, again, refreshingly honest, just that she truly became who she was as her life went on. She did so much. So was this a hard book to write for you? I remember sometimes when you were at Newsweek together, if I recall correctly, you could get pretty panicked about a deadline and worry about writing. And
that hasn't changed completely, but as a writer, if you're not scared of a deadline, then I'm not sure
how you ever get anything done.
But it motivates you, and I think one of the things about this book, and you and I had talked about this a little bit, that at Newsweek there was a limit to the word count, and there was a certain kind of way you wanted to present a story to really engage a reader in a short number of words. And the first book in this book allowed me to really just take a walk, in the language, and just really dig into these people in a way and really explore my own writing in a way, be a little bit freer. In this book, I put myself in a little bit just in terms of some of the observations I make. So it really was a wonderful experience. It's hard work, and it was often challenging to sort through, how do I want to say this, and how do I want to link this chapter to that? I do a lot of outlining. I rely on outlines completely, and it helps me focus and think through. So yes, it was hard in the way writing is always hard, and the first drafts are always terrible, but it was also really joyful. I just love learning about these people's lives. And I thought also that it was quite reassuring and heartening, because no matter where you are in life, you see these individuals just take off. Even, Grandma Moses, I have to keep looking at that fact that she had her first solo art show at the age of 80. And then she went on to launch an international 20-year career. So, I mean,
that's a late bloomer, and that was really one of those things. She'd been painting for a while. She'd had a rough life in many ways, but she'd been painting for a while. It was just the serendipity of an art collector coming through who was intrigued by her work and managed to really bring it to others and make it. I found that part of the book so interesting, because some of these people became great because they worked really hard. All of them were very capable, but some became great just because they were sitting at the right place at the right moment, or their work was hanging in a little storefront at the right moment.
Yeah, her story is incredible in that way. She had taken her paintings with some of her jelly up to the local fair. Prior to that discovery, no one had any interest in the art. They brought the jelly, but not the art. This guy, traveling through, he was an amateur collector. He just liked them, and he took them to a dealer. And I think another really interesting aspect of that, the dealer was an immigrant. He was somebody who had a very open vision of what American art could be and do at that time. And so she just lucked out, as you said. I mean, it was a really fortunate moment, and her career just took off.
And the same with Julia Child. I mean, yes. She was, the very luck of going to Paris, having this great experience, meeting somebody, not only having a husband who was as intrigued and engaged and involved in this, but then a writing partner who loved cooking and loved all the things she loved. And then also, it was, in many ways, it was Julia Child's personality. That, her physical size, the fact that she was a tall, large woman and just filled the room, whether she wanted to or not.
Yeah, absolutely. She did fill the room, and she, you mentioned her husband, Paul. It was, again, another serendipitous moment, meeting him in Asia where they were working for the government. And then he gets this job to go to France and Paris. And then she has that meal, literally, when they arrive. It's the first meal they have in France. And she just, the smells of those onions and the butter and the fish and the texture, that's a moment where I feel like it's not a light bulb moment necessarily. It's just an electric moment, I think. Maybe it is a light bulb moment. But for her, where she says, this, somehow this is what I've been looking for. And yeah, then she does that. And continues to learn to cook, and is a, cookbook connoisseur by the time she finishes, after many years, her first cookbook. But then she doesn't become the French chef on TV, which, that's how I think a lot of people know her, until she's 50. And, then goes on to continue to become enormously popular. And as you said, you're reminding me that, she fills the room, and she also used her middle-aged qualities in a way. And I say that in a positive way, that she was able to be completely comfortable with herself, be completely funny and quirky and silly, and tell off-color jokes, and be, filled with a kind of joy that had no self-conscious element to it, I would say. And I think that's what really absorbed and drew the fans. They could see, that's who I want to be, and that's the kind of cooking I want to do. And she was remarkable in that way.
It was infectious. She was someone, and you write her in such a way that you just, I'm sure it was hard, but not, or difficult, but not hard, because her personality was just so big and so strong. We also ought to make mention that you refer to Eleanor Roosevelt and Grandma Moses and others as late bloomers, but you don't mean that in any kind of pejorative way. That's actually quite a compliment.
It is. And I make a point of saying that I think, it's not, it's a compliment in the sense that these are people who were able to continue to grow and reinvent in some cases. Roget, for example, Roget's thesaurus, we all know. But he went into a career of science and medicine, and a stellar career. He spent decades doing that and publishing incredible works. But then when he was in his 70s, he wanted a continued purpose. He wanted something to do. And that's the same thing with Grandma Moses and Eleanor Roosevelt. I often think of that line that goes up, and you often think at midlife, it starts to go down. You see your life kind of declining in some way or heading toward an exit. And I think with them, I feel as if, and I think if we can all think this way, it just keeps going up. And with Roget, he had a love of words as a child. He kept word lists. But then in his 70s, he finally had time, and he focused on that love of this childhood love and compiles this thesaurus, which becomes a bestseller and has just recently been published again. So it is really, they're late bloomers in some ways, but they're also, grasping the best of life, no matter what age.
But they stay open. They're always learning. They tend to know themselves well enough to understand their passions, to not have repressed their passions so much that they can't pick them back up or follow them, or
yes,
that kind of thing. We should remind people that in a minute or two, we'll go to questions. So if you have them, please put them in the Q&A. We can talk forever, as I said earlier, but we'd love to engage you in the conversation too. Claudia, you wrote a lot in this book about childhoods, and in some instances they had dramatic effects that were tough. They were bad childhoods, but they motivated and led to a ability that surfaced later that really served the person in life. In other instances, they were idyllic childhoods that they were able to grow from. You come from journalism royalty. Your dad, as many people probably know, is Bernard Kalb. Was at NBC for years and years and years. And your uncle's Marvin Kalb. I know your mother Phyllis kept all of you going and growing. It must be kind of hard. I think of when we were working together at Newsweek, and we were both quite a bit younger, that it was hard for you to be the daughter of and the niece of. And now, maybe a midlifer yourself, you've emerged to be such an easy and successful writer and researcher of the human mind.
Well, I give credit. I mean, it's an amazing privilege and just a pure luck, serendipity, that I was born into the family that I was. And, I grew up with my father asking relentless questions, and every night at dinner saying, "What's the headline?" And as my sister reminded me recently, you need to be interesting. Whatever you do, you need to be interesting. And so there was always a grasp for detail, interviewing the guy at the Chinese restaurant. It didn't matter where we were. So that was a lesson in curiosity, endless and boundless curiosity. And my mother herself is an incredible writer. I would spend many an hour working on English homework assignments with her. I learned so much just in the home. And then my father and uncle together, and they're, coming from an immigrant family, and their ability to soar in the field of journalism, to become such incredible, accomplished journalists and mentors to so many others. It was scary in the beginning. I actually put it off for a while. I didn't think I could do it. I thought about different careers. I worked as a paralegal for a couple of years. I even did some pre-med in college. But, when I look back, writing it was always in me. I think that when words just float in your head constantly, there's something you need to pay attention to. And I just loved language. And so eventually I was able to be a little less intimidated, get that job at Newsweek with you, and really develop my skills. And then, now is certainly a midlifer, and can fully appreciate and just bask in the good luck I had to be born into this family of such wonderful writers and journalists.
Well, your uncle has logged in to our Q&A and asked a very interesting question. How did failure play into the success of the people you write about?
It's a huge part of success. And I think it's one of the things people try to avoid. It's really, I remember such a poignant moment myself in reporting when I was at Newsweek. There was a scientist, Judah Folkman, who was researching new kinds of cancer drugs. And I went to interview him, and he turned around during the interview after a very big success in something. And he turned around and he pointed to just rows full of notebooks and said, those are all the failures. That's all the stuff that didn't work. And you need to remember that. And it's true in any field. Interviewing Sarah Blakely, who is the entrepreneur, she actually was taught to almost seek out failure. Her father really believed in failure as a way to develop resilience and to move ahead. So I think failure, it really plays a role. Maya Angelou failing, she writes about failing and doors slammed in her face. All along the way, for many of the people who were in this book, there are serious challenges and failures. And I think in the end, it elevates you. It forces you to seek the successes and probably want them more.
And it may sharpen the questions for you too. You learn so much from failure that you're able to, when you move to the next step, you may actually be better at doing what you're doing and do it that way. Thomas Sackmar asks, can genius exist without ambition? Is there such thing as a reluctant genius? He said the question came to his mind when we were talking about Yo-Yo Ma and the questioning he did of himself later. All of these people did seem to have a level of ambition, although I think some of them, it took a while to find it.
Yes, and Tom himself is a wonderful scientist I met in reporting on Leonardo da Vinci. And I would say that, probably no. I mean, I think there is an element of talent, if you have it and you have an interest that you don't develop or you don't work hard at, it just goes nowhere. It's going to be stagnant. You need to, Maya Angelou talked constantly about how annoyed she would be when people would say, you write like a dream, how do you do that so easily? And she would think, are you kidding me? I'm sitting here with my, on the bed with the calluses and, getting up in the morning early and just pushing through what is so difficult. So I think the ambition is absolutely, it's sort of the thing that pulls you. It pulls the talent and helps really, propel it, because without it, you have nothing.
And in people like Fleming, when he goes away from, they make fun of him because his desk is always so piled high with cultures and papers and all kinds of things. He goes away for 6 weeks. He comes back. It's the fact that he's done all the things prior to that vacation that help him know when he sees that culture to stop and pay attention. And as you described, think, why is this different?
Yeah.
And I think it's not only ambition, but it's the intelligence to know what you're looking at and then act on it, or know what you love, or to be driven by your curiosity. Maybe curiosity is as important as drive.
I would say ambition maybe is defined in a very broad way as including a motivation, an eagerness to learn. It's sort of all in a way propels together. You don't necessarily need an ambition to be the best or to be, I think with Grandma Moses, she didn't set out to be a highly celebrated artist, but she wanted to do something purposeful. And I think that's another way of sort of driving that ability. And with Fleming, as you mentioned, he observed several years prior, he made a discovery of another substance that could work at being an antiseptic, but it didn't work very well. But he remembered what it looked like in the plate, and he remembered exactly how when he looked at the mold, how the bacteria was further away and it was clustered away, and the mold must be doing something. And what's truly amazing about Fleming is he was so unassuming, and he said things like, "Oh, that's interesting," and that was about it. And when he first, I think this is really fascinating too, that sometimes these moments are not even recognized at the time, these incredible moments. So when he gave his talk on penicillin to the scientific group, there was not much interest. Nobody asked a question. He almost presented it in such an stated way. So I find that fascinating that it wasn't until later that he became recognized.
Another person asks, what do all the people in your book have in common? What traits, characteristics, or life experiences? We've talked a little bit about what makes them similar, but what other things come to mind?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences in their actual stories and how they experience life, but there are just so many similarities in terms of intelligence of some sort. And I define that also not as IQ, but as sensitivity to music or art or science or math. I think it does show up somehow in who we are from the beginning to some degree. And then this kind of explosive curiosity, a willingness to really look past borders and boundaries, not to be pigeonholed. I mean, they all had some level of grit. I mean, I really think that needs to be there. You have to be really kind of purposeful, strong, and intentional to some degree about what you want to do. Nurturing and mentors are so important. I mean, parents in some cases, but it could also be a mentor in another case. Collaboration, they all collaborate in some way or another. There's kind of a myth that there's this sole genius out there. But even Isaac Newton had to rely on the scientific thinking of his predecessors. And, people learn from what came before and incorporate it into their work, or they work with Bill Gates. I mean, he's collaborated his whole life with people that he works with now with his wife, Melinda. I mean, that he talks about it, that collaboration is sort of everything to him. You can't really do anything solely on your own.
And Bill Gates recognizes his own limitations. I mean, he was in some conventional ways what we think about as genius in the way he attacked computer science, but he didn't have the social skills and the community, the ability to be in touch with the world, that Paul Allen brought to him and that others brought to him as he grew up. Speaking of collaboration, Betsy Kim asked an interesting question. What do you think of the role of public relations or marketing in exposing or the recognition of genius or talent? I mean, that's another thing that people don't know about it unless somebody helps get the word out.
Yeah, and I have to talk about Picasso in this question because Picasso, his art was dynamic and transformative and revolutionary and all of that. But Picasso also made choices early on about, again, intentional about the way his career would be remembered. So his name was Ruiz, was his father's last name, but Picasso sounded much better to him. It was different. It had two S's like Rousseau and other people. And he chose that name because he didn't want to be Ruiz. He wanted to be Picasso. Photography was exploding. He was inviting people to come take you can take photos of him. I think you can recall photos of Picasso on the beach, bare-chested, with his kids, and Life magazine displays of photography of Picasso. He also he dated all of his works, which wasn't routinely done. But I think in talking to his granddaughter Diana, we talked about how this was a part of his knowing that the work was going to last beyond his life, and people were going to need to study how he did it and what order he did it. So you can be a self-marketer, I guess, is the answer to that question, and a self-promoter in a way. Very different Picasso to, say, Fleming, as I mentioned, who was so completely unassuming. So I think, I don't know, in a lot of these cases, these are historical figures, so it's hard to imagine the same idea of a PR thing at the time that we have now. Now, contemporary figures can also really promote themselves through social media. I mean, it's a whole new world of that. Can you imagine Picasso on Instagram? It would be. So I think it's an interesting idea and a really interesting question.
This is a bit of a curveball, Claudia, so I apologize that it's just coming to my mind now. But I was inspired by a column today that Matt Bai, our friend and is now writing for the Washington Post, wrote about, I think it's the Bill Blankley controversy about Philip Roth. Mm-hmm. And in it, he refers to Picasso genius that he was, unbelievable talent, wasn't the guy you'd like to have come over and meet your children or hang out, particularly with your daughters. Do you have thoughts about, how we accept people's genius when they aren't necessarily the greatest people? Sometimes publishers cancel books, as happened this week. But if somebody had judged Picasso by his behavior as opposed to his production or his art, we probably wouldn't see a lot of Picasso paintings.
Yeah, I love this question. I would say that I need to spend the next 20 years thinking about it and I have thought about it, of course, and writing about Picasso and struggling to sort of say, can you separate the personality and the behavior from the art or the product, the art or the literature? When you study the arts, that there tends to be a really strong overlap of mental health issues and creativity. It's not a definitive link, but there are a lot of associations. There are plenty of artists who have struggled with mental health issues and thus not necessarily acted in a way that might be socially acceptable. And the list goes on. So I think it's a really hard question. I don't really know how to answer it. I think, do we take all the Picasso away and all of the other works of art, or do we try to embrace the works for what they are? Can you do that separately from the person? I am not going to venture to answer this.
I don't know the answer either, but I think it's a really interesting debate when we think about the great talent people bring to society, and the results of that talent are not always comparable to being a great person and a great life. Mark Silverstone says, "Hi, Claudia. How would you appraise political genius? Who might you rank as the most compelling among these figures?"
Oh, that's a good question.
We have a lot of politicians who we wouldn't describe as geniuses. Right. One come to mind or more that we could describe as compelling political geniuses?
Well, it's not my area, but I have to say, even in a way, I think about Biden and his ability to sort of come back in his life as kind of a genius moment, as somebody who was seen as sort of done with his career in a way he could fit in this book. I think there are so many political minds that are fascinating. I think the combination of Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR together is almost, more compelling to some degree than either one alone. I think that, there are so many interesting figures in so many different fields that I have yet to assess. It's hard for me to stretch that far, into any one of them. But I think the genius idea exists everywhere. There's also the idea of evil genius. And this came up in a conversation I was having with some friends. What about evil genius? Is that something? Thinking about certain leaders, Hitler and others that we know we have encountered. What's going on there? And it's another area, it's a tough area to explore. And I kind of stayed away from it. But yes, I think there is certainly genius in politics, just as there is in any realm.
And there's genius in individual politicians in the way we found genius in others. When you think about how John Kennedy could speak to the camera, how he did that so effectively against Richard Nixon, how he inspired a nation. And yet there were things about him we know now that weren't the most favorable. Bill Clinton, he was very charismatic and smart and capable, and Obama, there's so many people. George H.W. Bush, someone who was genius in part because of the experiences he'd had and was so competitive. So I agree with you that there've been so many. And yet maybe it's important to note that geniuses aren't perfect.
They're not perfect, but we have to add Martin Luther King. As a figure.
Oh, of course, Martin Luther King.
The genius in his ability to, just lead with such incredible wisdom and heart, and turn people's minds around and cultivate the kind of passion he did for civil rights. So I put him right at the top. But yes, it's everywhere, and it's an interesting aspect when you look through the lens of it into different domains and try to find it. Where is it and who has it and in what kind of way?
And John Lewis is another example of good trouble. he certainly found his voice along the way and was so important to that movement, and continued to be important right up until his death recently.
Yeah, and I think what they have in common is sort of the genius is in their ability to communicate and connect to people at a fundamental level. So
right, and maybe all of these people had an ability to, I guess they didn't all have the ability to connect to people, but they all had the ability to find ideas that were relevant to a greater world.
Right.
There weren't nobody in the book is sort of, as you say, they're not solo, but they also don't do things of meaning only to themselves, kind of thing. They have a lot of influence in the world.
Yes.
How much of the realization of genius is accidental? David Feinberg asks. Is there something about these people that allowed them to see and to know things that others of us might not miss? I don't think it's just their IQ.
No, it's not just IQ. And, I would love to know the answer, because that, I think, is a question that is going to take, in a way, decades to explore. And I'm not sure science, it sounds almost like a question about the brain. I mean, how do we function inside our heads that somebody can be so have that kind of vision that Leonardo da Vinci had, or especially in that case, that ability to see past from one subject to the next, to bound around and observe and be so curious what was going on in his brain. I think it's a really interesting question, and I've delved into some of that brain science to see if they found anything. They took they sliced up Einstein's brain and studied it and came up with some interesting little aspects of differences. But if you really want to do a good study on the brain of geniuses, you have to have a bunch of geniuses and a bunch of a control group. And you can't find a bunch of geniuses and get their brains that way. So it's probably, in a way, unanswerable. I think the way to answer is just look at those traits, those elements, the ingredients that include intelligence, but not specifically IQ. And these other, curiosity and grit and motivation and luck, all of this coming together.
So many, I don't know how you couldn't find the geniuses for brains, but how would you define a control group? Right. Because there are special things in virtually everyone. And that's what I found so exhilarating and encouraging about the book, that there was a chance at every stage in your life. And that in many ways you could say the best is always yet to come, because you don't know what great idea or what serendipity, what coincidence, what great luck you'll encounter tomorrow, kind of thing.
Right.
Go ahead.
I just think, I was thinking about it earlier today, and I think it's something I try to tell myself is you don't know. And that serendipity, if you are invited to a lecture or you see a class that you think that doesn't interest me at all, I think in some ways that's the place to go. Because those can be the moments that really spark something. It's a moment when your mind isn't focused in the same way it's used to focusing. It's forced to expand in some new way. And so, go seek something out that, you don't naturally find an affinity for, and you may discover it may not be the thing you're studying, but it may be something in yourself that comes to light when you are forced to think in a different way.
Ruth Nat writes in and says that she loves both your books so much, and she's asking what comes next for you. Is there a project you've always wanted to get to? I think this is both a great question and also sounds a little bit like one your father might have asked you at dinner right after you came home and presented your first great masterpiece. What are you going to do for us tomorrow?
Yes, I know. I think probably one of my wish list dreams is to do a biography of one person. I think I would, I'm sort of going from writing Newsweek stories that are sort of broadly based to small biographies and thinking, maybe I want to delve even further into just one life. So I'm not sure, but it's something I've thought about possibly as the next thing. I'm not quite there yet. more magazine stories, I would say, coming up, and then maybe a bigger project.
Well, Sharon Hager wants to know, how was this experience different than writing your first book, Andy Warhol Was a Hoarder?
In some ways it was similar in the sense of I learned a lot from that first book in terms of how to learn about a life, how to gather information, how to find stuff on the internet, which has been absolutely a gift to anybody writing today. So that gave me kind of a template. This one allowed me, I did do more on-site reporting. I had more time to do that, and being able to go to places, to talk to family members, to do contemporary figures in the book, not just historical figures. All of that changed the experience to some degree. And I did feel I could be a little bit freer in the way I approach some of the themes. I mean, it's always hard to decide at what point you have the authority to say something. I think in any kind of writing, and I think I felt in this book that I had learned enough from the first book, and in terms of interpreting how you use a biography and you use a series of biographies to understand human behavior, that I could be a little freer in the way I explored it and take a few more leaps, I would say, in terms of my analysis.
And the language you write with is so evocative and beautiful. You did a great job there. Is genius at risk if new potential to genetically correct faults in DNA is attempted? Scott Hildebrand's asking. What if we want to clone, come up with the perfect person? Does that ruin genius?
That is such an interesting question, and it's a great forward-thinking question. I think that no matter what we do with genes, and we're at a point where we can do a lot with them, you can't ever clone completely, and that's because environment is such a critical factor in anybody's life. Very little is defined by one gene. Any complex behavior is going to be a medley of different genes. They're still trying to figure them out for something like intelligence or, resilience or whatever it might be. So I don't think that, I think that, the danger to me that I would foresee is just that there's so much technology at a certain point that the mind shuts down too much. The quiet contemplation, which is so critical to moments of inspiration. Think about Isaac Newton's time at Woolsthorpe Manor, and Fleming going off on his summer holidays. And you think about, Thoreau taking walks in the woods. Anybody you study who had these incredible moments also had this other time when they allowed themselves time to think, to take walks, to ponder, to let everything that they had taken in, simmer for a while. So that's, I think, my bigger fear is, can we still find that time?
And something we've sort of learned, I think, in this recent year of pandemic, that a lot of us have been forced to slow down in ways that we might not have otherwise, and may have think of the genius that has been created out of this horrible time. It's kind of exciting. David Alpern, our former colleague and friend, in the Q&A is bringing up another author. And normally I wouldn't quote another author to you, but this is our dear friend, the late Sharon Begley, who was one of the greatest at writing about science. And she noted, I assume in a Newsweek article, that in genius, there is a tolerance for ambiguity, a patience with unpredictable avenues of thought. Like hikers ambling down a country lane with no particular destination or schedule, geniuses explore at leisure the blue highways of ideas. Wow.
Yeah.
That's just like what you were saying, that it is giving yourself in this fast-paced, crazy world we live in, giving ourselves time to think, to allow ideas to germinate, just to be surprised.
Right.
To be amazed, to see nature.
Yes.
You talk about taking the walk. Tell us about taking the walk that Eleanor Roosevelt walked.
And it's just such a simple, incredibly simple moment, walking through these woods, which don't look that different from any woods around your house or neighborhood. But just thinking about her taking that walk, and her grandson telling me this is the walk she would take with us, and we would talk to her about us and things. And she would also walk presumably and think about big worldly ideas, but this was her time, and she really did it all the time. Apparently, she walked and walked on that loop, and it's just a space to let your head. You think about us being, even physically being inside houses or offices, you're enclosed and your ceiling is a certain height, and then it stops. When you're in the woods, those ideas can just fly up into the heavens. I mean, there's much more to your space of thinking outside. And I think that that's where she found it. And I found that walk it was so fortifying, even though it was just trees and little bits of spring popping up. It was really wonderful.
Claudia, I say this, and many of our listeners will agree that you are a great protege and a worthy protege to Sharon Begley. This is a fantastic book. I was so excited and engaged in it. I hope everybody will buy the book, and I hope everybody will remember that to read it from start to finish, even though the chapters, I wanted to go read about Julia Child first, but I did listen to what you asked in the forward, and I did read it chapter to chapter, and you learn so much by doing it that way. So congratulations. What a joy it's been. And anybody, I promise you're going to love this book. It's really, really good.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you.
Thank the both of you. We did promise we'd save 1 second for your recommendations of what you're currently reading besides this excellent, intriguing title. So if you'd like to share with the audience what else you're reading or would like to code out.
I just want to quickly recommend to people a book that is just out called The Agitators by Dorothy Wickenden, and she'll be joining Politics and Prose soon. This is the story of 3 women who, Harriet Tubman, Stewart, and who am I forgetting? Martha Coffin-Wright, who are just Frances Stewart and Martha Coffin-Wright, who joined together to fight abolition. And then from it is born the women's rights movement. It's a spectacular book. The New York Times says it is an epic and intimate history. So get it. Claudia, what are you reading?
I'm reading and encouraging others to read. I'm keeping this in the family. My uncle has just written a new memoir. Fantastic. You must learn about his life because it's just a wonderful time in history. And I also have my cousins does a series of books for children using presidents as a way to get into the lives of adventure. And it's also wonderful. So I do that. And I have to say thank you so much to Politics and Prose, which love dearly and so appreciate this opportunity.
The best place to buy your books, order now.
You said it better than I could have. We at Politics and Prose really want to thank Claudia Kalb and McDaniel and our audience out there for tuning in with your bright, engaging questions. Your patronage and dedication enable us to bring you this type of live programming. And of course, we couldn't do it without the book sales to support it. So go ahead and follow the link in the chat to purchase Spark, How Genius Ignites from Child Prodigies to Late Bloomers, or you can visit us at politics-prose.com. And while you're there, feel free to check out our events calendar for everything else we've got coming up, not only this month, but in May. And from our shelves to yours, we hope everyone out there is staying safe, staying strong, and of course, staying well read. And we'll see you next time.